Hello, and today we're reviewing the Ridgid R8647 18-volt brushless reciprocating saw. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot, and it's an okay showing. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit of play or looseness to speak of, and the battery does wiggle back and forth quite a bit. So I would have liked to see the tolerances here be a little bit tighter. Luckily though, there is no impact to the performance of the tool, and I haven't had any issues with power delivery going to the tool being interrupted or the battery falling free. The battery slides into place fairly easily, and that's going to be a good thing because this tool is a bit of a battery hog, and it does require the max output series of batteries from Ridgid, which provide a little bit more power than the standard one. So if you want to get the most out of the saw, you will want to be using it with the max output powered batteries. And this thing will burn through batteries fairly quickly depending on, well, how tough of a job you're working on. Like all battery operated reciprocating saws, it's always good to have multiple batteries on hand, and so that's just my recommendation. But for the most part, while the tolerances are a little bit loose, everything here still is completely functional, so it gets a pass from me. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the grips, and it's a fairly good showing here. The rear grip is fairly well, designed. It's not too large, and there's definitely plenty of room for you to get your hands in and around, even if you're wearing thick gloves. The rubberized texture is fairly nice. There are tiny little dots or bumps all over the front of and rear of this particular tool's grips, and they definitely help you maintain a very firm grip on this particular tool, even if your hands are wet or oily. The front grip has plenty of rubberized texture up and down the entire, front of the tool, and while it is a little bit on the chunkier side, it definitely is not uncomfortable to use, and I think it's still an acceptable performance. But if it had been a little bit narrower, I definitely would not be complaining as long as we're not losing power. So in that regard, everything here is fairly good. The rubberized texture itself is a little bit loose. It's kind of a sleeve more than anything else. You can kind of see how you can peel it back a little bit, but it does a fairly good job at keeping your hand where you're at. I haven't noticed any sorts of major, twisting motions or anything where I feel like the tool is going to get away from me. So I think everything here is a fairly good showing. Now when it comes to the overall balance between the front and rear of the tool, it's fairly decent. It just kind of depends on where the center point is. It's right about here on the tool is about where the center point is. So I'm not going to say that's the most well-balanced tool in the world, but for the most part it is acceptable enough. So no real complaints there either. So for the most part, this particular tool is a fairly comfortable tool to use, and I definitely like how much rubberized texture that we got on it. So everything here gets a pass. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety. For the most part, it's a pretty standard design. Both of them are made out of black plastic, and it incorporates a simple push style safety. So when it's pushed all the way to the left, it is in the lock position and you won't be able to pull the trigger. And when you push it all the way to the right, well, then you can pull the trigger. For the most part, everything here is pretty standard, and I don't really have any major complaints. I definitely wouldn't trust this particular safety in a bag of tools because I think that there is a chance that it could get pushed all the way to one side, but since it does have the enclosed handle, there's less of a chance that the trigger gets pulled. But just to be on the safe side, I would definitely just, take the battery out when you're transporting this particular tool. For the most part, it's a fairly easy safety or trigger to activate. It's easily within reach, and you don't have to take your hand off the tool in order to put it into the safety or put it out of safety. So pretty normal there. Now the variable speed on this particular tool is quite good, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate to you right now. So at the low end, there definitely isn't that much of a slow speed, so that's a little bit of a disappointment. I would like to see a little bit of a slower speed down at the low end, but pretty much the rest of the range is quite good. So let me go ahead and show you now. So, as you can tell, or be deafened by, this particular tool has quite a bit of range with its variable speed, and it's a pretty slow ramp up, and there's definitely not really any major cliff faces in between the different speeds. So I'm pretty happy with the overall variable speed on this particular tool, and everything here gets a pass from me. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the Rafter hook, and this is kind of a cool feature. It has 3 different positions. You have basically your close position, your side position, and your straight up and down position, and this is a super useful feature in a variety of situations. Say you're working up high and you don't have anywhere to lay the saw and you want to hook it on your belt, well, although you do have to be careful when you're doing that, or if you just want to hang it over the side of, say, a board board and, well, leave it kind of just hanging there. It's just a very nice feature to have, and it's something I really enjoy that this particular, tool has implemented quite well, and it's something that you're starting to see out more and more tools, and I definitely am liking this particular design choice, especially if you're working in a tight area or somewhere that just doesn't have a lot of extra room. So this is definitely a cool feature, and I definitely enjoy having it. The hook itself is made out of metal and is secured to the tool with two small, machine screws, and it seems to be fairly reliable, and it doesn't seem like it bend easily, so I don't really have any complaints or worries about this overall design. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the Orbital Action Selector Switch, which is kind of just a cool design. This particular tool can operate where in the more standard, it just goes back and forth, or you can put a little bit of an orbital motion into that will help you cut quicker. And most of the time I have it on orbital because I'm not cutting through anything where I need to be too precise. So this is definitely a cool feature because it will allow you to finish your cuts a little bit quicker, and it's just, well, a nice little option. I really wish that Ryobi was implementing this on their new generation of tool, but they're not, so yeah, a little bit of a disappointment there. Although they are adding the Rafter hook, they're not adding the orbital mode, so yeah, something that's a little bit disappointing there, but hopefully it will be a better saw than the previous generation. So for the most part, the orbital function is super useful, especially if you need to make your cuts quicker. So this, quite frankly, is a very awesome feature that you typically only find on much more expensive saws. So I'm really happy that they integrated it into this particular tool. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, another cool feature in this particular saw is the fact that your shoe is adjustable, and it's fairly easily adjustable. This particular little latch at the bottom of the reciprocating saw in the front, if you flip it down, then you will be able to, well, remove the shoe completely or put it into several different positions. They do have a maximum spot indicated on this particular shoe, and I would definitely be careful not to lose it because probably finding a replacement part would be a little bit of a pain, but this is going to be a super useful feature, especially if you have a blade that's just about worn off in one spot and you want to keep using it, or if you need to have a more precise cutting area and you definitely don't want to cut into something else because your blade is the wrong length. So this is a super cool feature, and it's something that I really like seeing on a reciprocating saw. So definitely major bonus to them for implementing it on this particular saw. For the most part, the shoe itself is a fairly good showing too. Though the overall range of motion isn't that great, you really only have a very limited amount of range here, but for the most part it's a pretty good showing, and you really don't need that much with a shoe for the most part, although somebody out there probably will disagree with me. I haven't really ever had an issue where not having a lot of motion on the shoe has been a major problem for me personally, but like I said, somebody out there probably has. But for me personally, I'm pretty happy with the overall design here, and the fact that the shoe is adjustable into several different positions is definitely a cool feature, and it's something I wish that more brands would implement onto the reciprocating saws. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the blade changing latch, and for the most part it's an okay design. I personally like having the blade change lever or latch on the rod itself, but this is still an okay performance here. Well, you'll simply push up on the latch, and then you can remove your blade, and then when you let go, it'll snap back into the locked position. Unfortunately, it does not stay locked open, so that's a little bit of a disappointment there, but it's still a fairly easy tool to work with, and I definitely like it better than the large latch levers that feel like they're going to break that are on the Ryobi tools. So for the most part, it's a fairly simple design. I don't think that there really isn't anything that's too bad. I haven't had any issues with the rod becoming bent yet on this particular tool, so everything, fingers crossed, seems to be fairly well engineered here and made out of good materials, unlike on some of the Ryobi saws where the rod that holds onto the blade sometimes can become bent or misaligned with the latch, causing you to have to bend it back into the proper shape in order to get the blade to be released or to put a new blade in. So for the most part, I'm pretty happy with the overall design here, but I personally would have liked to have seen the latch removal lever on the rod itself, but that's just more of a personal preference thing than anything else. So for the most part, everything here seems to work fairly well, and it gets the job done. Moving on. Okay, another nice feature on this particular tool would be the fact that it has a light, which is actually fairly rare for reciprocating saws, and it definitely can be useful. Although it's not that bright, it can definitely provide a little bit of a illuminated area, and it definitely seems to help you get your blade placed better because of the shadow that is causing it to be projected off of the blade. So it can help you aim a little bit, especially if you're in an awkward position. So quite frankly, it is kind of a cool little feature to have, and while while I wish it was brighter, it is nice that we got a light, since, you know, most reciprocating saws just don't have lights on them. So, quite frankly, it's a cool little feature to have, and I'm grateful that they integrated it on this particular tool, but maybe make it brighter next time. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the weight of the tool. Now, without a battery, this particular reciprocating saw weighs 3,061 grams, which is about 6.7 pounds, or 62 grams. You know, it's about 6.7 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour battery, it weighs 3,753 grams, which is about 8.2 pounds. So it's a fairly heavy reciprocating saw, but it definitely pays off for the increased amount of power that the saw can provide. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, let's talk about the saw in use. And I have to say, this is definitely probably my favorite reciprocating saw to use, just because of, well, its features. Having that orbital function definitely makes quick work of, you know, wood or nail encrusted or embedded wood. And quite frankly, I think that you could probably use it on even more objects than just that, but they say it really is only meant for wood. But, you know, I find it to be a super useful feature. And also with the adjustable shoe length means that if you have a worn out spot on your reciprocating saw blade, but the rest of the blade is still fairly good, that means you can kind of compensate and get around, you know, having to throw out a blade that still has plenty of good area on it. And well, this is definitely a money saver in that regard. The other super nice feature on this particular saw is that rafter hook. The rafter hook is definitely a cool feature, especially if you are working in a very limited area with a, well, an area that has very limited surface area, and you can just, well, hang it up over your head, hang it up below you, hang it off the rafter next to you. I don't know, it's just a super cool feature, and it definitely comes in handy in a variety of different situations. So this is definitely another super cool feature on this particular saw. I do think that this particular saw does have a kind of a downside, and that would be how fast it can burn through batteries. I noticed while using it that it definitely seemed to chew through batteries quite a bit faster than my smaller one-handed Ryobi reciprocating saw, so that is a little bit of a disappointment, just because, well, you're going to need multiple batteries to make this a realistic saw for large projects. But if your project's small, or you already own multiple batteries, this won't be a major deal for you. Another area that I wish was a little bit better would be the price tag. Although this thing does have plenty of features, and it probably is worth the price that they're asking for it, I'm a cheapskate, and I always want my tools to be a little bit cheaper. So, yeah, for the most part, the price is a little bit on the high side, and I think that if it had been priced a little bit closer to $140, that would have been a little bit more preferable in my own opinion. But, well, you know, I'm a cheapskate, so yeah. So for the most part, everything here gets a pass for me, and I don't really think there are any major negatives. So, yeah, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. Okay, starting off our list of pros and cons, we have it being a fairly powerful reciprocating saw. This thing is definitely capable of, well, cutting through pretty much anything you throw at it, as long as you have the appropriate blade, and it's going to be far better than anything from Ryobi, and it's better than my Makita brushed reciprocating saw, so in my opinion, this is definitely a pro. So, moving on. Brushless. The brushless motor is definitely going to be a far superior option to a brushed motor, and in this current year of 2025, there really is no reason to buy a reciprocating saw that has a brushed motor. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Adjustable shoe. The adjustable shoe is such a nice feature and will definitely save you money. The fact that you can adjust where your blade is sitting is a huge game changer in a lot of ways. So in my opinion, this is a major pro. LED light. It's really nice having a reciprocating saw that has an LED light on it. While it may not be the brightest, at least it has one. Moving on. Rafter hook. The rafter hook is another super cool feature that will allow you to hang this tool up in spaces where the surface area is limited, or if you just, well, want to hang the tool up, well, when you're done using it. So in my opinion, this is another super cool feature and a pro in my opinion. And the last pro would be the orbital action switch. This is going to definitely speed up your jobs when you're cutting through wood or nail embedded wood, and so in my opinion, this is another super cool feature and a pro. And the first meh would be the blade change lever. There really isn't anything wrong with it, and it works just fine. But my own personal preference is that you have the blade change lever on the driving rod rather than on the side of the tool. Because, quite frankly, if it does end up getting bit or misaligned, well, the lever will become pretty much worthless in that, you know, scenario. So, quite frankly, this is kind of a meh in my opinion. And the second meh would be the battery life. This thing has a very powerful motor, which also means that you're going to burn through batteries quicker. This isn't a negative, it's just something that you need to be aware of. So just take that into advisement when you are looking at purchasing this particular tool. And the first con would be the price. Coming in at $170 means that this is a fairly expensive reciprocating saw, and quite frankly, it's a little bit hard to pay that price for this particular saw. It is feature-packed, and there is a lot going for it, but I definitely think the price tag would be far more appropriate if it had been closer to the $140 or $150 mark on the, well, price tag. So, yeah, just something to be aware of. Moving on. And last but not least, the slowest speed. It is extremely hard to get to the slowest speed on this particular reciprocating saw, so in my opinion, that's a little bit of a con. Not a major one, but definitely a bit of a con. And that's it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular reciprocating saw. I really like this saw. There are lots of very useful features packed into it, and it has plenty of power, and quite frankly, there really isn't that much that can go wrong with this particular reciprocating saw when it comes to its performance. It does burn through batteries extremely quickly, and it is kind of high priced, but for the most part, it does an excellent job, and you are definitely getting what you're paying for with this particular reciprocating saw. I've been using it for a little over a year at this point, and it definitely has been a fantastic saw in a variety of different situations. I've used it from removing a stump in the ground to, well, breaking up tons and tons of pallets. And it's done an excellent job in all those different scenarios. I've cut through metal a few times with this particular reciprocating saw as well, and it handles everything fantastically well as long as you're using an appropriate blade. So at the end of the day, this particular reciprocating saw, while it is expensive, does come recommended for me personally. So with that being said, we will see you all next time, and God bless.